She was weeping. Behind the delicate lace of her wedding veil, tears streamed down the face of one of the most beautiful young women in America. Outside St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, 300 policemen held back thousands of spectators desperate for a glimpse of the bride. Inside, the cream of New York society waited in uncomfortable silence as the ceremony was delayed. 20 minutes late. Something was clearly wrong. It was November 6th, 1895. The bride was just 18 years old. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and she was about to become the Duchess of Marlborough, mistress of one of England's greatest palaces. To the world watching through the stained glass windows of Gilded Age America, this was a fairy tale come true. An American princess marrying into British royalty. Headlines screamed of romance, of glittering futures, of dreams realized. But Consuelo knew the truth. This was no fairy tale. This was a transaction. Her tears were real. Her heartbreak was fresh. And somewhere in New York City, the man she actually loved was reading about her wedding in the morning papers, forbidden from ever seeing her again. The story of Consuelo Vanderbilt is not simply a tale of wealth meeting aristocracy. It is a story about the price of ambition, the cruelty of control, and the remarkable resilience of a young woman who was sold to save a crumbling English palace. It spans continents and decades, moving from the marble halls of Newport to the cold corridors of Blenheim, from the drawing rooms of the Gilded Age to the battlefields of 2 world wars. This is the story of an heiress who wept at her own wedding and lived to find redemption. To understand how Consuelo Vanderbilt became a pawn in one of history's most infamous arranged marriages, we must first understand the world that created her. And that world was dominated by one woman, her mother, Alva. Alva Erskine Smith was not born into the Vanderbilt fortune. She clawed her way to it. Born in Mobile, Alabama in 1853, Alva grew up in a world of Southern gentility built on the backs of enslaved people. Her family's wealth came from cotton, and when the Civil War devastated the South, their fortunes crumbled along with the Confederacy. The Smiths fled to Europe, where young Alva received the education of an aristocrat, even as her family's money dwindled to almost nothing. She attended boarding school in Paris, developed a taste for French culture, and learned a crucial lesson about survival. In a world where women held little power, beauty and strategic marriage were the only paths to security. By the time Alva returned to America in the 1870s, she was nearly penniless, but armed with ambition and a fierce intelligence that would make her one of the most formidable women in American history. Her target was William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the legendary Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon who had amassed one of the greatest fortunes in American history. When Cornelius died, his estate was worth over $100 million, an almost incomprehensible sum that would be worth billions today. William was handsome, generous, and perhaps most importantly, extremely rich. Alva married him in 1875 and immediately set about conquering New York society with the same ruthless determination she would later apply to her daughter's future. But here was the problem. The Vanderbilts, for all their money, were considered nouveau riche. The old money families of New York, led by the formidable Mrs. Carolyn Astor, looked down on them as common railroad people who had merely gotten lucky. Mrs. Astor's famous ballroom could hold only 400 guests, and she made very certain that no Vanderbilt was ever among them. Alva would not be denied. In 1883, she threw the most extravagant costume ball New York had ever seen. The party cost her husband $3 million, an astronomical sum that funded elaborate costumes, mountains of flowers, and enough champagne to fill a small lake. Mrs. Astor's own daughter desperately wanted to attend, but there was a problem. Alva had never been formally introduced to Mrs. Astor, which meant, by the strict rules of society, she could not send the Astors an invitation. The scheme worked perfectly. Mrs. Astor was forced to call upon Alva first, acknowledging her as a social equal. It was a stunning victory. Alva had forced open the doors of New York high society through sheer force of will and spectacular amounts of money. Into this world of calculated social warfare, Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2nd, 1877. From her first breath, Consuelo was a project. Alva looked at her infant daughter and saw not a child to love, but a tool to wield. Where Alva had clawed her way into American society, Consuelo would catapult the family into something even more prestigious: European aristocracy. The training began almost immediately. Alva believed that perfect posture was essential for a lady of breeding, so she devised a torturous solution. Throughout her childhood, Consuelo was forced to wear a steel rod that ran the length of her spine, fastened around her waist and shoulders. Hour after hour, day after day, the metal contraption held her ramrod straight while she studied her lessons, and those lessons were relentless. By the age of 8, Consuelo could read and write fluently in English, French, and German. Every Saturday, Alva forced her to recite endless poems in all 3 languages. There were lessons in music, in art, in dance, in deportment. The curriculum of a princess preparing for a throne she never asked to occupy. When Consuelo made mistakes or showed any sign of defiance, Alva's punishment was swift and brutal. She beat her daughter with a riding crop, the same instrument used to discipline horses. Years later, Consuelo would describe her mother as a born dictator who whipped her for the slightest infraction. The cruelty extended beyond physical punishment. Alva controlled every aspect of her daughter's existence. She chose Consuelo's clothes, her friends, her activities. When teenage Consuelo once dared to object to a dress her mother had selected, Alva's response was chilling. "I don't ask you to think. I do the thinking. You do as you are told." Consuelo's bedroom in the family's Newport mansion, the magnificent marble house, was deliberately designed to reinforce her powerlessness. The room was gloomy and austere, the heavy drapes blocking out the sunlight and the sound of the sea. Even within the walls of her own home, she had no space that truly belonged to her. Yet despite this suffocating control, or perhaps because of it, Consuelo developed into a remarkable young woman. She was exceptionally tall for her era, with a swan-like neck that became her trademark feature. She had dark, intelligent eyes and a gentle manner that charmed everyone she met. Writers fell at her feet. J.M. Barrie, the creator of Peter Pan, once said he would stand all day just to catch a glimpse of her. But beneath the cultivated grace and perfect posture, Consuelo harbored something her mother had not anticipated: a heart of her own. His name was Winthrop Rutherford, and he was everything an American heiress could want. Tall, handsome, impeccably dressed, Rutherford was considered the most eligible bachelor in New York society. His pedigree was flawless, descended from Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch governor of New York, and John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts. He was one of the 400, that exclusive circle of old money families that Mrs. Astor deemed worthy of her ballroom. Consuelo met him during her debutante season, and the attraction was immediate and mutual. Where the men Alva paraded before her daughter were calculating and cold, Winthrop was warm and attentive. He listened when she spoke. He made her laugh. For perhaps the first time in her carefully controlled life, Consuelo felt seen. Their courtship was necessarily secret. Alva's spies were everywhere, and she had made her intentions for Consuelo's future perfectly clear. Only a duke would do. A mere American gentleman, no matter how distinguished his bloodline, was beneath consideration. So they met in stolen moments, at parties where Alva was distracted, during carefully orchestrated carriage rides, in the brief interludes between lessons and social obligations. And slowly, carefully, Consuelo fell deeply in love. On her 18th birthday, March 2nd, 1895, Winthrop sent Consuelo a single red rose. It was a romantic gesture, a promise of things to come. That spring, during a bicycle excursion along Riverside Drive, away from her mother's watchful eye, Winthrop proposed marriage. Consuelo said yes. For a brief, shining moment, she believed she had found her escape. She would marry the man she loved, build a life of her own choosing, free from the steel rods and the riding crop and the relentless pressure of her mother's ambition. She should have known better. Alva discovered the engagement almost immediately. Her network of informants was extensive, and Consuelo's happiness was impossible to hide completely. The confrontation that followed was one of the most brutal episodes in a childhood already marked by cruelty. Alva raged at her daughter, calling her stupid, ungrateful, blind to her own best interests. She attacked Winthrop's character, claiming there was madness in his family, that he was incapable of having children. Whether she believed these lies or simply invented them for the occasion remains unclear. What matters is that she was prepared to say anything to break her daughter's will. When words failed, Alva escalated to threats. She told Consuelo that she would not hesitate to shoot any man who tried to ruin her daughter's life. It was a veiled threat against Winthrop, delivered with the cold certainty of a woman who had never been denied anything she truly wanted. The battle continued for weeks. Alva swept Consuelo off to Europe, hoping to distract her with the glittering courts of the old world. Winthrop followed, desperate to maintain their connection. But Alva's servants had strict instructions. His letters were intercepted. His visits were blocked. He was never allowed within sight of his fiancée. Back in America, the siege intensified. Alva locked Consuelo in her room at Marble House. She forbade visitors. She cut off all communication with the outside world. And when none of this broke her daughter's resolve, she played her final card. Alva took to her bed, claiming that Consuelo's disobedience had caused a heart attack. She appeared to be dying, her face pale, her voice weak. A servant was sent to Consuelo's locked room with devastating news. Her mother's last wish was to see her daughter married to the Duke of Marlborough. If Consuelo continued to resist, the stress would surely kill her. Faced with the apparent death of her mother, even a mother who had tormented her since childhood, Consuelo broke. She sent word to Winthrop that their engagement was ended. She agreed to marry whomever her mother chose. The woman who had spent 18 years fighting for every scrap of autonomy finally surrendered. Within days, Alva made a miraculous recovery. To understand what Alva wanted for her daughter, you must first understand where she came from and what she had already built. By 1895, Alva had constructed 3 of the most spectacular homes in America. The first was the Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue in New York, a limestone palace designed by the legendary architect Richard Morris Hunt in the French Renaissance style. It was here that she had thrown her famous costume ball, the party that forced Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her existence. The second was Idle Hour, a sprawling estate on Long Island, where the family retreated for weekends away from the city. It was Consuelo's favorite of the three, a place where she could occasionally escape her mother's relentless surveillance and pretend to be a normal young woman. But the crown jewel was Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island. Alva had commissioned Hunt to create something that would make even the Astors envious, and he had delivered magnificently. The exterior was clad entirely in 500,000 cubic feet of white marble, imported at enormous expense from quarries around the world. The interior featured a gold ballroom, whose every surface was covered in 22-karat gold leaf, a dining room with pink Numidian marble walls, and a Gothic room filled with medieval artifacts that gave the space the feeling of a European castle. Marble House cost William Vanderbilt $11 million to build, a sum that would be worth hundreds of millions today. Alva called it her temple to the arts. To Consuelo, it was simply another gilded cage. But for all its magnificence, Marble House was merely an American imitation of European grandeur. Alva wanted the real thing. She wanted her daughter installed in an actual ancestral palace, with centuries of history behind it, and a genuine aristocratic title before her name. She found exactly what she was looking for across the Atlantic. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, was everything Alva wanted and nothing Consuelo needed. Known to his friends as Sonny, a nickname that bore no relation to his actual temperament, the Duke was 24 years old when he first met Consuelo. He was short, surly, and supremely conscious of his own importance. Those who knew him described him as critical, suspicious, and without intellectual qualities. His primary qualification for marriage was a title that traced back to the first Duke of Marlborough, the military genius who had won the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. That victory had earned the first Duke something remarkable. A grateful Queen Anne had gifted him an entire palace, the only non-royal building in England to bear that title. Blenheim Palace was designed to rival Versailles, a monument of English Baroque architecture covering more than 2,000 acres. Its construction took nearly 20 years and nearly bankrupted the nation. The architect was Sir John Vanbrugh, a playwright turned designer who had never built anything on such a scale. Working alongside Nicholas Hawksmoor, he created something that divided opinion from the moment the first stone was laid. Some called it a masterpiece of theatrical grandeur. Others thought it overwhelming, a monument to ego rather than elegance. The Duchess Sarah, wife of the first Duke, famously despised Vanbrugh and eventually had him banned from the construction site. The palace that emerged from this conflict was undeniably impressive. The main building featured a central block flanked by two enormous wings, creating a forecourt large enough to drill an army. The Great Hall rose 67 feet to a ceiling, painted by James Thornhill, depicting the first Duke kneeling before Britannia. The long library stretched 180 feet, one of the longest rooms in any English house, filled with over 10,000 books and a magnificent Willis organ. The grounds were equally spectacular. The original formal gardens, designed by Henry Wise in imitation of Versailles, were later transformed by Capability Brown into a more naturalistic English landscape. Brown created the Great Lake by damming a small river, and the resulting body of water became one of Blenheim's most celebrated features. The park itself was planted with avenues of trees, arranged to represent the positions of troops at the Battle of Blenheim, a permanent memorial to the military triumph that had made everything possible. Generations of dukes had lived and died within these walls. Winston Churchill himself had been born here in 1874, his mother having gone into premature labor during a ball. The room where he entered the world was preserved and would later become a place of pilgrimage for admirers of Britain's greatest wartime leader. But by the time Sonny inherited the dukedom in 1892, Blenheim was in dire straits. The massive pile required constant maintenance, its ancient heating systems barely functional, its vast rooms impossible to warm. The family fortune had dwindled through generations of aristocratic mismanagement. The ninth Duke faced a simple choice: find an enormous amount of money, or watch his ancestral home crumble. He found his solution in America. The practice of exchanging American dollars for British titles had become so common by the 1890s that newspapers printed regular tallies of the sums involved. Wealthy American families, eager for the social prestige that came with European aristocracy, were willing to pay handsomely for the privilege of calling their daughters duchesses and countesses. 9 American heiresses married British nobles in 1895 alone. These women came to be known as dollar princesses, American girls whose vast fortunes propped up crumbling English estates. The British aristocracy, prohibited by tradition from engaging in trade or commerce, found itself increasingly unable to maintain the enormous houses their ancestors had built. American industrial wealth provided a solution that preserved their dignity while filling their coffers. The transactions were remarkably transparent. Newspapers listed the dowries as casually as they might report stock prices. The New York Times kept running tallies of money flowing from America to British nobility. Everyone knew the terms of these arrangements, and no one pretended they were anything other than business deals dressed up in wedding gowns. Lady Minnie Paget, an American-born wife of a British general, had made herself wealthy as a professional matchmaker, introducing American money to British titles for a commission. It was Lady Paget who brought the Duke of Marlborough to Alva Vanderbilt's attention. The negotiations that followed were conducted like a business transaction, because that is exactly what they were. The Duke arrived in Newport in the summer of 1895, ostensibly for a vacation, but actually for an inspection of the merchandise. He stayed at Marble House, walked the grounds, attended the parties, and carefully evaluated the young woman being offered to him. Consuelo, still devastated by her forced separation from Winthrop, could not bring herself to be charming. The Duke found her intelligent but distant, beautiful but cold. No matter. The terms being offered were too generous to refuse. The proposal took place in the Gothic Room at Marble House, a gloomy space filled with medieval artifacts that perfectly matched the occasion's emotional temperature. It was not a romantic moment. It was the formalization of an agreement that had been negotiated between the Duke and Alva, while Consuelo was locked in her room upstairs. But even this was not the final humiliation. On the morning of the wedding, the Duke arrived at St. Thomas Church 20 minutes late. The delay was not caused by nerves or traffic. The Duke had been engaged in last-minute negotiations to squeeze additional money from the Vanderbilt fortune. The final settlement was staggering. The Duke received $2.5 million in railroad stock, a sum that would be worth nearly $100 million today. Additionally, William Vanderbilt agreed to pay the couple $100,000 annually for life, with provisions for an additional $2.5 million trust upon his death. Over the course of the marriage, the Vanderbilt family would transfer approximately $20 million to support the Duke and his ancestral home. When the bride finally appeared, anyone who looked closely could see that her face was swollen from crying. She had spent the morning in tears, alone in her apartment. A footman posted outside her door to prevent escape. Not even her governess was allowed to comfort her. The ceremony proceeded despite everything. Consuelo spoke her vows in a voice barely above a whisper. The Duke barely looked at her, and when it was done, the newspapers declared it the wedding of the century. On their honeymoon, the Duke made something very clear to his new bride. He told her that he had given up the English woman he truly loved to marry her. He despised anything that was not British, and he had married her only because it was the only way to save Blenheim Palace. Consuelo's prison had simply changed locations. Blenheim Palace was designed to impress, and it succeeded magnificently. The main building stretched hundreds of feet across the Oxfordshire countryside, its yellow stone towers rising against the English sky. The Great Hall soared 67 feet above a floor that could hold hundreds of guests. The long library contained over 10,000 books. The staterooms were hung with priceless tapestries depicting the first Duke's military victories. But magnificence and comfort are not the same thing. Consuelo arrived at her new home in the winter of 1895 and immediately discovered that English aristocratic living bore little resemblance to American luxury. There was no central heating. The massive fireplaces could barely warm the rooms they occupied, while corridors remained frigid. Hot water was a rarity. The bathroom facilities that Americans took for granted were considered unnecessary innovations by English standards. From her bedroom window, the new Duchess looked out over a pond where a former butler had drowned himself. It seemed an appropriate view for her state of mind. The staff presented their own challenges. Over 100 servants maintained Blenheim, operating according to a strict hierarchy that Consuelo, despite her mother's relentless training, had never encountered. When she innocently asked the butler to light the fire in the drawing room, he was deeply shocked. Such a menial task was the footman's responsibility, and asking the butler to perform it was a grave breach of protocol. Her mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess, interrogated her constantly about whether she was yet in the family way. The production of an heir was the primary purpose of her presence, and everyone was anxious to see whether the American investment would pay dividends. Dinners with the Duke became exercises in endurance. They sat at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 40, making intimate conversation impossible. The meal proceeded through endless courses while Consuelo struggled to maintain composure. Years later, she would write of how she learned to dread and hate these dinners, how ominous and wearisome they loomed at the end of each long day. The Duke's personality made everything worse. Sonny was obsessed with Blenheim to the exclusion of all else, spending his days supervising renovations funded by Vanderbilt money, while barely acknowledging his wife's existence. His emotional range ran from cold to contemptuous. He collected porcelain with more passion than he ever showed his family. English society, meanwhile, treated Consuelo with the peculiar mixture of fascination and disdain that greeted all the American dollar princesses. She was exotic, fabulously wealthy, and thoroughly suspect. The aristocrats who accepted her hospitality whispered behind her back about American vulgarity and new money pretensions. Yet something remarkable happened during these difficult years. Consuelo discovered that she was more than the decorative object her mother had created. Her genuine kindness won over people that her money could not impress. The poor tenants on the Blenheim estate, who had every reason to resent another grasping aristocrat, found in the young Duchess someone who actually cared about their welfare. She visited their cottages, listened to their troubles, and used her influence to improve their conditions. They adored her in a way that the Duke, despite generations of family connection, had never managed to inspire. She also found an unexpected ally in her husband's cousin, a young politician named Winston Churchill. Churchill was everything the Duke was not: energetic, enthusiastic, intellectually curious, and blessed with a gift for conversation that could light up any room. He was the life and soul of every gathering at Blenheim, and he and Consuelo formed a deep friendship that would last their entire lives. She delighted in his company. Whether it was his American blood or his boyish enthusiasm, qualities sadly lacking in her husband, she found in him a kindred spirit who made her exile bearable. There was also a practical dimension to their bond. Under the laws of succession at the time, Winston was next in line to inherit Blenheim if the Duke died without male heirs. Consuelo's job was to produce those heirs, and thereby prevent her new friend from becoming Duke. It was a peculiar foundation for friendship, but genuine warmth grew despite it. In 1897, Consuelo gave birth to a son, John, who would eventually become the 10th Duke of Marlborough. The following year, she delivered another boy, Ivor. She had produced what the aristocracy called an heir and a spare, securing the succession and fulfilling her contractual obligations. The phrase heir and spare is now commonly used to describe royal succession planning. It was Consuelo Vanderbilt who coined it. But even as she fulfilled her biological duties, Consuelo was quietly transforming herself into something more than a decorative accessory to her husband's title. She had come to England as a trophy, purchased for her fortune. She would leave as something far more valuable, a woman who had found her own voice and purpose. The transformation began with small acts of rebellion against the cold formality of aristocratic life. When she visited the tenant cottages on the Blenheim estate, she did not merely perform the expected rituals of noble condescension. She sat with the families in their cramped kitchens. She held their babies and listened to their troubles. She learned their names and remembered their stories from one visit to the next. The tenants had seen many duchesses come and go, most of them as cold and distant as the marble statues in the palace gardens. This American woman was different. They sensed that her compassion was genuine, not performed for social credit or family obligation. Word spread through the estate and beyond that the new duchess actually cared. With her biological duty complete, whatever pretense of a marriage had existed evaporated entirely. The Duke and Duchess lived increasingly separate lives under the same enormous roof. A few years into the marriage, something happened that would haunt Consuelo for the rest of her life. She encountered Winthrop Rutherford again. The old feelings had not died. Consuelo spent 2 weeks with him in Paris, and when she returned to England, she confessed everything to her husband. She told the Duke that she was still in love with Winthrop and wanted to leave England to be with him. The Duke, displaying perhaps the only generosity of their marriage, agreed to let her go to London to discuss the elopement with Rutherford directly. But when she arrived, she discovered something devastating. Winthrop refused to take her. Perhaps he feared the scandal. Perhaps he had moved on in the years since their forced separation. Perhaps he simply could not bring himself to help her escape a situation that would destroy both their reputations. Whatever his reasons, he sent Consuelo back to her husband and her unhappy life. The Duke, upon learning of this rejection, departed for South Africa to visit his cousin Winston, who was serving in the Boer War. He remained away for 6 months, apparently unable to look at his wife without remembering her betrayal. When he returned, Consuelo confessed to having begun an affair with his own cousin, Reginald Fellows. There may have been other affairs as well, with the artist Paul César Hileo, who painted her portrait numerous times and possibly others. The Duke's second wife would later suggest that Consuelo's younger son Ivor was not actually the Duke's child at all, but Rutherford's. By 1906, the charade had become unbearable. After 11 years of marriage, the Duke and Duchess officially separated. Consuelo wrote that life together had not brought them closer. Time had only accentuated their differences. The nervous tension that grows between people of different temperament, condemned to live together, had reached its highest pitch. She moved out of Blenheim Palace forever. The woman who emerged from her failed marriage was fundamentally different from the weeping teenager who had walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church. Freed from the Duke's suffocating presence and her mother's relentless control, Consuelo discovered she had a voice of her own and causes worth fighting for. She threw herself into charitable work with an energy that surprised everyone who had dismissed her as merely a decorative ornament. She became obsessed with improving conditions for the poor, particularly mothers and children. She established the Children's Jewel Fund, which collected donations of jewelry to support child welfare centers. During the First World War, this single initiative funded more than 160 centers, providing care for vulnerable children. She campaigned for progressive social reforms that were radical for an aristocrat of her era. She supported free school meals for poor children, free medical inspections, national insurance for workers, and old-age pensions. She was politically liberal in a class that treasured conservatism, and she made no apologies for her positions. Most significantly, she became a champion of women's suffrage. She saw the vote as a means to remedy the social welfare problems she witnessed daily, a way for women to gain the power necessary to protect themselves and their children from the kind of manipulation she had suffered. In this, ironically, she followed in her mother's footsteps. Alva Vanderbilt, after the death of her second husband Oliver Belmont in 1908, had transformed herself into one of America's most prominent suffragists. She hosted rallies at Marble House, the same mansion where she had imprisoned Consuelo, now converted into a staging ground for women's liberation. Mother and daughter found themselves on the same side of history, though Consuelo rejected the militant tactics that Alva embraced. Where Alva supported the more confrontational approach of the British suffragettes, Consuelo believed in working within the system to achieve change. Her London townhouse, Sunderland House on Curzon Street, became a gathering place for intellectuals and reformers. Her salon attracted the leading minds of the era. H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and J.M. Barrie were regular guests. She moved easily between the world of aristocratic privilege and the world of progressive politics, using her position to advance causes she believed in. She had been raised as a pawn. She became a queen. The formal divorce came in 1921, more than 15 years after the separation. The delay was due partly to social convention, partly to complicated negotiations over money and children. But this was not the end of the legal maneuvering. The Duke had converted to Roman Catholicism and wanted his first marriage annulled so he could remarry within the church. Annulment required proof that the original marriage had been invalid, which in turn required testimony that Consuelo had been forced into it against her will. This is where the story circles back to where we began, to the truth behind those tears at St. Thomas Church. In 1926, Alva Vanderbilt stood before an ecclesiastical tribunal and made an extraordinary confession. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," she testified. "I have always had absolute power over my daughter." It was perhaps the only moment of genuine honesty in Alva's long life of social calculation. After decades of controlling her daughter, she finally admitted what everyone had always suspected. The marriage had been a transaction, pure and simple. Consuelo had been sold. The annulment was granted. The Duke remarried his longtime mistress, Gladys Deacon, though that union would also end badly. And Consuelo, finally free of all the legal and religious entanglements of her first marriage, was at last able to pursue happiness on her own terms. She had found it, in fact, more than a quarter century earlier, though circumstances had denied her the chance to act on it. Jacques Balsan first saw Consuelo Vanderbilt in 1894 at her coming-out ball in Paris. He was 26 years old, French textile heir with a passion for aviation. She was 17, dazzling in her debut gown, and completely unattainable. The young Frenchman fell in love on the spot. He watched from afar as she was marched to the altar with the Duke. He built his own career as a pioneer aviator, working with the Wright brothers, winning prizes for balloon flights, setting altitude records. During the First World War, he organized aerial reconnaissance for the French army and rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He married another woman, Alice Morton, the daughter of a former American vice president. They had children together. But through all of it, moving in the same elevated social circles as the Duchess of Marlborough, he never quite forgot the beautiful American girl he had seen in Paris all those years ago. Alice died in 1917. The Duke and Duchess separated. And finally, after 27 years of waiting, Jacques Balsan was able to court the woman he had always loved. They married on July 4th, 1921, American Independence Day. She was 44 years old. He was 52. And for the first time in her life, Consuelo Vanderbilt had married for love. In her autobiography, published decades later, Consuelo titled her book, The Glitter and the Gold. The glitter was her first marriage, all the surface brilliance of titles and palaces that concealed such emptiness beneath. The gold was her second marriage, the real and lasting treasure she found with Jacques. They built a life together in France, in a chateau near Paris called Saint-Georges Motel. Winston Churchill was a frequent visitor, painting in the gardens, debating politics over dinner, maintaining the friendship he and Consuelo had forged during her darkest years. They also kept a villa on the French Riviera, where they entertained celebrities and royalty. Charlie Chaplin came, the Maharaja of Kapurthala, the Duke of Connaught, son of Queen Victoria. Consuelo continued her charitable work, now focused on French children. She ran a summer play school for local families and eventually built a sanitarium on her property large enough to house 80 sick children. Jacques supported every endeavor, proud of his wife's compassion and grateful for every day they spent together. It was, by all accounts, a very happy marriage. But history was not finished with them yet. In September 1939, Winston and Clementine Churchill were staying at Saint-Georges Motel when news arrived that changed everything. Germany had invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The world Consuelo had known, the world of aristocratic privilege and international society, was about to be consumed by fire. Jacques, despite being in his 70s, immediately rejoined the French military. He was given charge of organizing the Free French Air Forces in London. Consuelo threw herself into Red Cross work, helping refugees fleeing the advancing German armies. When France fell in, 1940, the Balsans found themselves in terrible danger. Consuelo's wealth and connections made her a potential hostage. Her friendship with Churchill, now Prime Minister of Britain, made her a target. They had to escape. Their flight from the Nazis reads like a thriller. They made their way through occupied France to Spain, then to Portugal, always one step ahead of the German forces that would have delighted in capturing a former Duchess of Marlborough with ties to the British government. Consuelo wrote to Winston, begging him to ensure Jacques' safe return to America. Churchill, never one to abandon a friend, personally intervened to facilitate their escape. The couple eventually reached the United States, where they spent the remainder of the war years dividing their time between Florida and Long Island. In 1932, during happier times, Consuelo had built a house in Manalapan, just south of Palm Beach. It was an enormous mansion of 26,000 square feet, designed by the society architect Maurice Fatio. She named it Casa Alva in honor of her mother. It was a remarkable gesture. After everything Alva had done to her, the steel rods and the riding crop and the locked rooms and the forced marriage, Consuelo named her happy home after the woman who had caused her so much pain. Perhaps it was forgiveness. Perhaps it was the complicated love that persists between parents and children despite everything. Perhaps Consuelo simply recognized that her mother, for all her cruelty, had also given her the education and the strength that allowed her to survive and eventually thrive. Alva died in 1933, having lived long enough to see women win the right to vote and her daughter find genuine happiness. Whatever reconciliation occurred between them happened privately, away from the newspapers and society columns that had documented their conflict for decades. In 1946, Consuelo received a very special visitor at Casa Alva. Winston Churchill, on his way to Missouri to deliver what would become known as the Iron Curtain speech, stopped to see his old friend one last time. Some historians believe he polished that famous address in her Florida home, the former Duchess of Marlborough providing feedback on the words that would help define the Cold War. Their friendship had survived 40 years and 2 world wars. It would continue until his death in 1965. But Consuelo would not live to see it. In 1956, tragedy struck twice in quick succession. Jacques Balsan died in November, ending 35 years of happy marriage. Less than 2 months earlier, her younger son Ivor had died of a brain tumor at the age of 57. She had found love late and lost it. She had raised sons in a loveless marriage and buried one before his time. The girl who had wept at her wedding had become an old woman who had known both the depths of sorrow and the heights of joy. In her final years, Consuelo divided her time between New York and Southampton, a familiar figure in communities that had once followed her every move with breathless fascination. The days of her notoriety were long past, but she had not lost her aristocratic tastes. Having once admired a Louis XVI room in a French chateau, she had the entire room transported to her Long Island home, where it remained until her death. She published her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, in 1953. The book was well reviewed but notably discreet about the worst aspects of her marriage and her mother's manipulation. Even in old age, some wounds were too deep to fully expose. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died on December 6, 1964, at her home in Southampton, Long Island. She was 87 years old. Her will specified that she be buried not in America, where she was born, nor in France, where she had found happiness, but in England, at St. Martin's Church in Bladden, Oxfordshire. This was the parish church for Blenheim Palace, the prison of her youth. She was laid to rest beside her younger son Ivor, in the churchyard of the estate she had once been sold to save. It was a strange choice, to return in death to the place that had caused her such misery in life. But perhaps Consuelo understood something that her mother never did. That our lives cannot be reduced to their lowest moments. That even the worst experiences shape us into who we become. That Blenheim, for all its cold corridors and lonely dinners, had also given her the strength to become something more than a pawn. Her sons continued the Marlborough line she had been purchased to perpetuate. Her grandson, the 11th Duke, would maintain Blenheim for another generation. Her great-granddaughter Diana would marry into an even more famous family and become Princess of Wales, though that story too would end in tragedy. Today, Blenheim Palace stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists every year. They walk through the same halls where Consuelo once wandered in despair, where she raised her children in a loveless marriage, where she dreamed of escape to a life of her own choosing. In the gift shop, you can buy postcards of the palace and books about its history. The guides mention that Winston Churchill was born here, that the first Duke won a famous battle, that the gardens were designed by Capability Brown. Sometimes they mention Consuelo, the American Duchess who saved the palace with her fortune, the dollar princess who wept at her wedding, the woman who coined the phrase heir and a spare. But no postcard can capture what she really was. A daughter who survived a tyrant mother, a wife who endured an empty marriage, a philanthropist who fought for the voiceless, a woman who waited 3 decades for love and found it at last. She was also a symbol of something larger than herself. The dollar princess phenomenon that defined her era was really a story about the collision of 2 worlds. The old aristocracies of Europe, rich in titles and tradition, but poor in cash. The new plutocracies of America, drowning in industrial wealth, but hungry for legitimacy. Young women like Consuelo became the currency of exchange between these worlds, their bodies and their fortunes traded for coronets and social standing. Some of these marriages worked out, many did not. What made Consuelo's story resonate across the decades was not just her suffering, but her survival. She did not merely endure her fate. She transcended it. She lived through the death of one era and the birth of another. She watched the Gilded Age crumble into the trenches of the First World War and the rubble of the Second. She saw women win the vote she had championed, and aristocratic privilege fade into tourist attraction. And through it all, she maintained the perfect posture that her mother had beaten into her, the steel rod having done its work even after it was removed. She carried herself like a duchess long after she stopped being one. The tears she shed at St. Thomas Church dried eventually. The heartbreak of losing Winthrop Rutherford healed, though it took decades. The cruelty of her mother became, in time, something she could acknowledge without being destroyed by it. Consuelo Vanderbilt was sold at 18 to save a crumbling English palace. She bought herself back, piece by piece, year by year, until she owned her own life at last. In the end, that is what makes her story worth remembering. Not the tragedy of her arranged marriage, though that is dramatic enough. Not the glitter of her wealth, though it was genuinely spectacular. But the gold she found beneath it all, the love that waited for her, the purpose she discovered, the woman she became when no one was forcing her to be anything else. She walked into St. Thomas Church weeping. She walked out a duchess. But it took her decades more to walk out of the prison her mother had built around her. When she finally escaped, she was free. Today, if you visit the churchyard at St. Martin's in Blaydon, you can find her grave. It lies in the shadow of Blenheim Palace, the great pile of stone that cost the Vanderbilts millions and the young Consuelo her youth. The headstone is modest by Vanderbilt standards. Nothing flashy, nothing grand. Just her name, her dates, and the peace she finally found. The American girl who became an English duchess, the prisoner who became a champion, the pawn who became a queen. Consuelo Vanderbilt, 1877 to 1964, at rest at last. And somewhere in that quiet churchyard, beneath the shadow of the palace that cost her so much, the girl who was sold for a title finally found something that could not be bought or bargained away: peace.